you also wrote last year a framework and a roadmap for how a real revolution could be wrenched out of the crisis that we are currently living through in this country at this time. The main title of which is Something Terrible or Something Truly Emancipating. And a lot of decent people look out at the world if they're not sheltering from it and refusing to look. A lot of decent people see the terrible or dimensions of it. They see the looming threat of open inter-imperialist war, even nuclear war, the environmental crisis. They see the rising fascism in this country and the obliteration of really essential rights of the people. And you write about that and you analyze that, but you also see the potential for something truly emancipating. And I wonder if you could, I would like to ask you to talk about what do you see as the positive potential? What is that?
Well, the positive potential is the other side of everything you just described. In other words, and in particular, the fighting that's going on within the ranks of the ruling class itself, where they cannot resolve their differences in the way that they have held the country together and ruled it for like over 100 years, almost going back to the Civil War. I mean, obviously, in the Civil War, they had an all-out fight between different sections of the ruling class, the slave-owning class and the capitalist class. But since they resolved that, you know, they basically had this procedure. They have elections, you know, the winner takes office and the losers accept the results of the election. It's the peaceful transfer of power that they're always bragging about, which is the peaceful transfer of power. Let's be real and get down to the real of it. It's the peaceful transfer of power from one section of the ruling class to another section of the ruling class. And these days, one section represented by the Democratic Party and another section represented by the Republican Party. But what's different now is that the Republican Party is made up of people, and it has a social base of people who no longer recognize the legitimacy of that process unless it results in what they want it to result in. And they regard, this is important to understand, they regard whole sections of the people as illegitimate. They regard gay people, trans people, they regard, independent women, ones who are not just, willingly, quote unquote, but not so willingly subordinate to men. Black people, immigrants, Latinos, they regard all those people as illegitimate. And the reason that this base of people out there in the tens of millions actually, for the most part, I think actually believes, because they believe all kinds of nonsense and crazy theories, but I think that most of them actually believe that the election in 2020 was illegitimate. And they've been given a rationalization for that the election was stolen, there was massive fraud, et cetera, et cetera. But what's just barely beneath the surface, and the real reason they think that election was illegitimate, was that all these people I just mentioned overwhelmingly voted for someone other than them. And those people are illegitimate in their eyes. Therefore, the election was illegitimate. That's what really going on here. And so why have they come to that position? Because up until World War II, this was a country where white supremacy was institutionalized, legalized in the law, was supported by all sections of the ruling class. Some may say some words about this or that, but they all were part of its institutionalizing it, where women were in a second-class position, subordinated and oppressed and brutalized in all kinds of ways that there was no legal redress for. You could legally rape your wife throughout the country until at least the 1980s in many states. And forget about any gay rights or trans rights or anything like that. So, that's the way, and it was a country that, while it theoretically had the separation of church and state, was all but officially a Christian nation. I mean, look at the currency and how the government institutions begin with a prayer and so on and so forth. And then, in these people's eyes, along came this evil woman, Madalyn Murray O'Hair, who challenged, prayer in the schools. And things were changing in the country. So the ruling class, through the Supreme Court, made a concession and ruled in her favor. And they said, because we have in the Constitution separation of church and state, therefore you can't have state institutions like public education officially promoting a particular religion or religion in general. So, and if you listen to these Christian fascists, and that's what they are, they're white supremacists, male supremacists, virulently anti-immigrant, patriarchal, misogynist, racist, all this, anti-gay, all the rest of it. If you listen to them, many of them will say, and do say openly, everything in this country went to hell when they threw the God out of the schools. And they're fighting to get, quote unquote, God back into the schools, because the God they're talking about is the God of the Christian Bible, which is, just in its very, deep nature, is a patriarchal document. I mean, you just look at it and read it, and, I've read the whole thing. And it's just patriarchy from beginning to end, from Genesis to Paul, and Jesus too in certain ways. But it's just overall a patriarchal document. And so, once that got undermined, once the state couldn't go, promoting that, these people see this as the unraveling of everything. And it's interesting. Most of them, for a while, wanted to openly be white supremacists. They wanted to openly oppose the civil rights movement, openly, insist on segregation. You look at Jerry Falwell, who founded the Moral Majority, and all the rest of these types like that. Falwell was vigorously opposed to the civil rights movement. But then at a certain point, they realized, well, we're not going to win that fight. And plus, it's a disadvantage to us to keep pushing on that, because the wind is going the other way on that. So what did they do? They retrenched into patriarchy. Not that they weren't still white supremacists, but in terms of what they brought to the forefront, they were always, misogynistic, patriarchal forces anyway. But then, they brought that to the fore and started making abortion the big question, that made it what it is. The key, concentration of whether women are going to be enslaved or whether they're going to be on the road to being emancipated. And they've been fighting, rallying reactionary forces around that as the concentration, along with the kicking of God out of the schools, the concentration of everything that's wrong in this society. And I've told this story before. Richard Pryor, back in the 70s or whatever, had this routine where he'd say, they're talking about these fascist types, these Nazi types, these types that are now the MAGA people, And he said, brothers say they're not afraid of no Nazis. Hey, Mr. Nazi! He said, but if you actually see a real Nazi, you're going to be running fast as you can run. Well, and then he went on to say, you got to understand, they got all these people down in the basement, chained up down in the basement. And you don't want to see those people get off the chain and out of the basement, because they are going to come after you, and they're going to come after everything that you hold dear. Well, the fact is, those people are out of the basement and off the chain. We could talk more about why, it gets more, we have to get more into things. But they're out of the basement and off the chain, and they have no intention of going back. So, and then the Republican Party unleashed this base, and now there's this kind of back and forth, or a dialectic, as we say, where the base is imposing necessity on the official politicians to go along with it, and then when the politicians go along with it, then that gives even more encouragement to the base to become even more rabid. And there's no way these people are going to settle for the continuation of limitations, not the ending, just any kind of limitation on white supremacy, male supremacy. You can't have all this gay stuff, all this trans stuff, blah, blah, blah. There's no way they're going to accept any of that, even this impartial and ultimately not that significant concessions. So, they're not going to let a government come to power that is illegitimate in their eyes because it's making concessions to all these things that they think are completely intolerable. And that's why you hear them say, this is war. When do we get to start shooting? All these kind of things. Well, they're not, and you hear the Democrats complaining that the Republicans, are, a threat. Even Biden now started to call them semi-fascists. That's about as much as he could go. When they're, just outright blatant and aggressive fascists. White supremacists, male supremacists, all the things I was running down. So the Democrats keep complaining, well, they're not playing by the rules, they're not going by the norms, they're breaking the norms. At the same time, the fascists are openly and aggressively saying, yes, that's exactly what we want to do. We want to break all these norms because these norms are leading this country into a shithole. And, you know, we can't go with that anymore. And so they're not willing to go along with the normal stuff that's been happening. Okay, that's why you could get, besides what's going on in the international arena, with a growing threat, people should wake up, a growing threat of nuclear war. You know, and with the U.S. provoking China, U.S. imperialists, Biden, Nancy Pelosi, provoking China over Taiwan on the one hand and backing Ukraine against, yes, real Russian aggression, but the U.S. is not opposing that because they want to liberate people anywhere. You know, they're the biggest enslavers of people on the entire planet. But what they do want to do, and, you know, the Secretary of Defense openly said they want to weaken Russia. So they're arming and backing and giving intelligence and planning and everything. They're basically using Ukrainian troops to fight Russia at this point, with American and its, you know, NATO allies arming them. This is, and you know, now you got Putin talking about if Russian integrity and territory and the Russian people are threatened, we'll use, he said it twice, we'll use every weapon at our disposal. So that means nuclear weapons. And then the U.S. says, well, if they use even tactical nuclear weapons, there will be a very heavy price to pay, and we've told the Russians what that price will be. What the fuck are they talking about? They're talking about the future and the existence of humanity with this Russia thing and China thing, you know, and then there's a whole environment which you see what's happening with it, you know, countries, you know, a third of Pakistan underwater, to just cite, you know, and the recent hurricanes, you know, which are worse because of the warming of the oceans and other things. So, you know, all this is going on, and there's no way they can put this all together on the terms in which they ruled it for all this time. And that could lead to something, you know, just think about what I was just talking about, something really terrible, but it also provides an opening because all this shakes people awake. I mean, look what happened when they overturned Roe v. Wade and the right to abortion. You know, millions of people who went along thinking, oh, they'll never really do that, and things are okay, and things will work out, got really, you know, shaken down to their toes by what, and people are still extremely upset about this, and these kind of things are going to keep on happening, and this is going to shake people out of the sense that they can just, you know, things are just going to go along the way they always have. They're going to cause people to question things. And then you got the people at the base of society who are always catching hell but are caught up in a lot of bullshit. And life is going to get even worse for them too. And this is where the revolutionaries come in. Because left to itself, all this will go only one way, to something terrible. But this provides a greater objective basis to actually break the hold of this system over people and to win them to see the need to uproot and abolish this whole system and to understand that we can no longer afford to allow these imperialists in this country or others to have the fate of humanity in their hands with the extremely dangerous and increasingly existential threat that poses to human civilization. And among these basic people right at the you know, foundation of society, the people catching the most hell, we can go to them, and we need to go to them and explain to them what's going on in very simple terms, maybe a little shorter than what I just did. But give them a basic understanding of what's going on and what their role can be and needs to be in terms of transforming this terrible situation into an emancipating situation by building up, not going at the system all out right now when all you could do is get crushed, but building up, you know, putting revolution on the map. Putting a scientifically based revolution on the map in terms of youth from among the basic people, youth from among the educated, you know, the college educated, but especially the people right catching the worst hell, taking the stage, you know, and we can and have to say to them, this is your mission. This is your mission, to put revolution on the map. Not all this garbage that people think is, you know, want to think is the way to go, you know, all this, you know, I got my mind on my money and my money on my mind and dogging down the women and all this bullshit. Put revolution on the map. Put it on the map by standing up against the system. You want to do something that takes heart? Take on this system. Stand up against this system and all of its atrocities, and build up the forces of revolution so that we can create the conditions where we can have millions of people ready to go for the whole thing. You know, like similarly to what you see in Iran now. I mean, I don't know where that'll go. You need leadership for it to go to revolution. Our comrades there, the communists, you know, in Iran, the people who've taken up a new communism, they're striving and struggling to win leadership and give leadership in that situation. But you know, that kind of massive upheaval, you have that, and then you have an organized leadership with a scientific method and strategy. Then you can direct all that toward the actual struggle to bring this system down, and you can actually have a basis to disintegrate, to defeat and disintegrate what are now very powerful institutions of armed enforcement of this system. It's not where we're at now, but that's the mission that people need to take up. And all these youth in particular who are caught up in going at each other need to turn around, lift their heads, not act in the way the system wants them to act, not act in the way that it tells them is the only thing that they're good for, but act as emancipators of humanity. And act to get rid of all the madness that they are put through, and people just like them all over the world are put through, which is the reason why they act in such crazy ways, because they don't see a way out of that. And we, with a scientific method and strategy, have to provide them, give them the way out of that, and nothing less than that.